Okay, so this module is all about all the key aspects of management with sunflowers. So it's all the critical things like row spacing, plant population, nutrition, irrigation, water use, okay? So I've split this module into 4 different components. So we'll start off with crop establishment and basically work through the sections. We're in module 2. So the first thing with sunflowers is paddock selection, and Vicky's already talked a bit about weeds and the herbicide options. So it's important for sunflowers to try and put them in a place where you know they've got the best chance of possible success. So because you know there's not many options for broadleaf control, obviously look for paddocks that have low broadleaf weed populations where possible. Try and put them into a situation where they're not going to be hosting the same diseases, and Sue will talk about those next. So things like sclerotinia, so if you're following a rotation that's had quite a high dominance, I suppose, of canola or some of the other broadleafs like chickpeas, then that's going to be a point of consideration for you. On the upside, sunnies are a great rotation crop for getting away from some of our key cereal diseases. So they don't host crown rot, and that's always going to be a big factor in the north. Sunflowers are very well suited to no tillage, so they like to be sown into a no-till situation, and the majority of the crop in the north goes in that way. But they are also quite happy to be put into a situation where it's full tillage. So if you're putting them under an irrigation system, they're quite happy to go on beds and actually grow in that way as well. Okay, so soil type requirements. Sunflowers are quite flexible in their adaptation to soil types. They prefer to be in, I suppose you'd say, neutral to alkaline soils. And so typically we see them grown on anything from about a 6 to about a 9 on a pH scale. They don't particularly like very acid soils, so stick away from those. Otherwise, the probably main considerations are if you have saline or sodic soils. I've included a bit of data where I've been able to find it on the effects of salinity. And so as you can see up on this table, once you get above about 3 decisiemens, you start to be affecting your seed weight, and once you get above 4.5, you start to be having some fairly major impacts on your yield. In terms of sodicity, there's probably 2 key factors there. The first one is obviously sodic soils at the surface. So where you have crusting, you can see some significant delays in the actual germination and establishment of the sunflowers. And then if you have subsoil sodicity, then it makes it more difficult for those sunflowers to extract water from deeper in the profile. Okay, so we'll move on to sowing times. Now, sowing time is always a bit of a compromise. The first thing I tell people to consider with their sowing time is the end use of their crop. So if you're going to be sowing polyunsaturated sunflowers, then avoid that early spring plant. If you're going to be growing confectionery sunflowers, you can grow them early or late, and you can really match their sowing time to how it fits your situation and your rotation. The critical thing is to look for those heat stress periods, as I've talked about earlier, so that 12 to 15 days after flowering on the spring plant, and to consider your frost risk. When we look back over sunflower production in the north for the last 20 years, you start to see a couple of fairly obvious trends come out. The spring plant is typically the higher yielding crop, and that's because of the huge biomass that develops under those longer growth periods that you see in the time from planting to flowering on the spring plant. Earlier sowings also tend to have slightly higher oil contents on the whole. This is long-term average. On the other side of things, if we look at the late plant, it obviously offers the opportunity to double crop. So people that are looking to either use up excess water in the profile or to increase their cash flow, then that's really where sunflowers fit with that late plant option. Late plant sunnies, though, also offer other challenges in terms of seed fill during those cooler temperatures, trying to get away from frost at the end of the season when it could be damaging. And also Sue's going to talk a bit more about the prevalence of some of the diseases on the later plant option. Late plant sunnies are also more typical to end up where they basically need to be dried down. So they're often standing in the paddock up until now or not so far from now, and that means you may need to look at drying them down. The other option there is to include a desiccation, which is not a hugely popular option. Obviously it's an additional cost, but where you've got quite a lot of weeds coming through onto your sunflowers, then people have probably considered desiccation as a more of a better option there for an early weed control, or if the paddock's a bit variable in terms of trying to even up the actual development there. So when should you be sowing your sunflowers? What we're starting to find is that the spread of sunflowers is stretching across the states, and so we've had to pretty much widen out our sowing times here. So at the moment now we're talking to growers anywhere from central Queensland, so we're up there 2 years ago, right to this week we've been down as far as Moama and talking at Griffith to growers down there. So you're seeing a broad stretching of the sunflower growing regions, whereas typically over the last 10 years it would have been more northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. So how do we then adapt our sowing times to those areas? And I know there's a few people from variable areas here today. So we'll just talk, largely about two main areas here. The first area is probably this Gunnedah Corindi, so looking at the plains. And the second area, which is probably not as well covered off here, and I'm just thinking, I think I've included it in the manual, but haven't actually put it on this slide, is looking more towards central New South Wales and this kind of area. With sunflowers on an early plant, obviously you're thinking about the soil temperatures and looking for that 10 to 12 degrees to try and give you an indication of how soon you can sow. Most sowings on the spring plant are starting in that mid-September to late September kind of period. As you move further south, obviously your sowing time is going to be influenced by how warm it is, and so you'd expect the sowing time to be pushing back slightly more as you move further south. Now, soil temps at the moment, I was going to say, Kathy, you said 9 degrees for here. I know our soil temperatures in the north have been running around 6 to 7 degrees, and down at Griffith they were running about 5.5 to 6. So there's quite a bit of variation, and you can use that MET data to actually give you a better indication of when to sow. One of the other benefits with sunnings is obviously this split planting opportunity. So how late can we go? I think I've probably put most of the extremes out here, and definitely we tend to prefer our late plantings to be finished by early to mid-January, and that's to try and get away from the risk of frost at flowering and the slow dry down that's associated with that later planting time. And so I kind of change this talk depending on where I am, but there's some pretty readily accessible data out there about the percentage chance of frost. But there's basically a range of data out there where you can go through and look at what's the percentage chance of risk of a frost for all locations across New South Wales. So what most of the guys in southern New South Wales were asking me about was that question about, well, if we're at the moment early October, can we move that planting window further forward? And there was quite a bit of discussion about that because obviously they're wanting to push that planting window further forward. And so we were using some of this data to just talk with them about, well, how late is their last frost really likely to occur, and potentially there is some movement in those planting opportunities. Okay. So if we look at seeding depth now, sunflowers are typically sown in that 3 to 5 centimetres depth, but they can be sown down as deep as kind of 7.5 or 3 inches. Now you obviously are not trying to sow them deep unless you are really short on moisture, and so it's a moisture seeking situation. In terms of sowing depth, the focus is always going to be on getting that seed into good soil moisture, and the other factor is going to be in relation to keeping a bit of distance there from other fertiliser and considering how much starter fertiliser you're putting down. I often get asked questions about how can we improve the establishment, and so I started looking for some of the weird and wonderful ways that people have gone about trying to improve their crop establishment in the past. So I had to go back to the 70s to some work here and look for what were they actually doing to try and improve their establishment. With this work they tried 3 different options. What was quite popular was pre-soaking seed in that era, and they found that it really didn't improve things. So 2 out of 10 sites did that actually give any improvement. Same went with water injection, just purely water injection, because you're just not putting on enough water to actually make a substantial difference. The thing that did have the biggest effect, even in the 70s, was using press wheels. And so I think that leads into the use of planters and what's going to give you the best result. In terms of planters, the ideal is to go with a precision planter with press wheels. But we know that people don't always have access to those, and so there's no problem with using air seeders or even having people using combines. The key thing is to try and actually get your uniformity right though. So whatever you're using as a planter, you want to try and establish as uniform a stand in the paddock as you can. Increases in yield have been documented of 10 to 15% from actually getting those uniform stands. And that comes down to things like uniform access to moisture, also thinking about uniform weed competition across the paddock. So gappy stands will mean that there's going to be more access for weeds to kind of take those opportunities in those gaps. And also in terms of overall crop uniformity in terms of its development. So when you have plants that are close together and then spread far apart, you'll see distinct differences in not only the head size, but also the time that it takes to dry those heads down. The next section is all about, I suppose, the hybrid selection, row spacing, and plant population. So we'll start off with hybrid selection. Pretty much as rules of thumb, tell people that there's a couple of things to consider up front with hybrid selection. The first one is always crop end use. What's the market that you're targeting? After that, it always helps if you can access some data looking at what are the local yields in your area. So what are the local yields and hybrid oil contents, or if it's just confectionery, obviously yield only and perhaps how they're dehulling locally. After that, it's looking at those finer traits like environmental adaptation. Are you going with an early plant? Are you going with a late plant? And there's some variations there. And most importantly, it's obviously seed availability. There's no point looking to plant it if you can't buy the seed. Now, I really like this table because the first thing that comes to my mind is that there's about 100 wheat varieties on the market. And when growers or advisors ask me what they should be planting this year, it's always a bit of a process to go through the culling stages and tick all the wheats off. Now with sunflowers, we don't have that. There's 3 companies supplying seed, and Liz has introduced them all this morning: Pack Seeds, HSR Seed and New Seed, and they all have hybrids that are suited to the area. So if you went through the previous step about, well, what am I going to plant this year in terms of end use, you'd start to see that the decisions become a lot easier. So if you're looking to plant a monounsaturated hybrid this year, you've got 4 options. You've got Aussie Gold 61 or Aussie Gold 62, you've got Sunny Lake 06, or you've got High Lake 41. So straight up, things are a lot more easy to kind of work through. If you go to the polyunsaturated hybrids, then you can see on the table here, again, the options get a little bit less. You've got Advantage, you've got Aussie Gold 4, which is the dual purpose hybrid that I talked about earlier. And that's pretty much it. If you're going confectionery, then you're looking at Galar or Sunbird 7s. The other information that's available on these hybrids is some of the growth stage data that was included in the previous module, and also things about their overall crop height and head inclination. There are some differences that are quite noticeable in the field in terms of the way the plants grow. And a good example, I suppose, is between some of the Aussie Gold lines and High Lake 41. In particular, I often get growers comparing Aussie Gold 61 or 62 to High Lake 41 in terms of their length of actual seed fill and dry down. High Lake 41 is a medium slow, so the time taken to flowering between those 2 hybrids is almost identical, but from flowering to actual physiological maturity, they're quite different hybrids. And you'll notice that the High Lake 41s tend to have almost like a stay green component, similar to what you would expect with sorghum, where they'll actually retain their green leaf and the green material for a longer period of seed fill. They're just different characteristics with those hybrids and how they perform. There is a little bit of hybrid trial data available, and for those of you who have never seen the New South Wales Summer Crop Production Guide. There's a few copies of those publications on the back table, so please take them. And this table is just an excerpt out of that. The reason I put this table up primarily is to say to people that while it's great to have some local hybrid data, and it's great to talk to other growers or advisors in the area about what's performing well, the biggest factor with most of our hybrids is actually not their genetic potential, but how we manage them. So if you look at this table, you'll see that any of the hybrids that have the same letter behind them over this 5 years of trialling have performed the same. Okay? The numbers might be slightly different, but in terms of significance, when the data is analysed, there is no significant difference. Okay? Where you will start to notice differences, and where you would expect to, is when you look at oil contents, particularly when you're looking at the confectionery lines. Their oil contents are always low, and that's because we're not looking for oil. We're looking for that dehulling suitability for that market. But there is a bit of data out there, so I'd encourage you to access it where possible. Okay, plant populations. Regardless of the type of planter that you're using, always try and target a specific plant population. So I don't mean, say, I'm sowing at 2.3 kilos to the hectare. I mean a specific number. I'm trying to establish 35,000 plants, whatever the number is that you decide on, and then try and access that information off the bag, so things like seed number and germination, to target your actual plant populations with that information. So what populations do you target? There's quite a lot of variation in the overall target populations. In a dryland situation, you don't need, you don't need to establish any more than about 35,000 plants to the hectare. If you're in a more marginal environment, you might want to bring those populations back. So the guys at Moree, for example, are generally only looking to establish about 28,000 plants. As you move down into the plains, you'll see some of these populations will vary a bit, and particularly those guys on the southern end of the plains will possibly establish slightly higher populations. So the question is then, well, how do we come up with these numbers? And most of the time you'll be happy to know that there's some data behind them. For the dryland populations, yes, there is. There's quite a lot of good data, and I'll show you a couple of slides from those. For the irrigated populations, there's a lot less data. And so that's something that we are working on at the moment, is trying to establish a better data set for those irrigated populations. At this point in time, from what I've seen, I would say to people with irrigation, they don't need to be establishing any more than 50,000. If you're really looking at completely unlimited access to water, then you might want to go slightly higher, but be aware of the changes that will actually occur in terms of the plant type. More plants will mean those plants will compete with each other, they'll tend to grow taller, and typically you'll see that they'll have smaller heads because there's so much more crowding. You'll also see that their stems will be a lot thinner. Now in some situations that's probably a little bit nicer in terms of how thick some of those stalks can get for management. So to put some data in there, I basically added a couple of trials, and I need to give a big acknowledgement here in particular to Peter Winton, because Peter's been a very long-term cooperator with trials for me, and also I know Joe Fleming has been a great cooperator for the DPI, and in particular Bill Manning. So if we look at some of this population data, I'll just flick through a couple of slides, and what you'll see is that largely, if you're moving from 27 in this trial, 27,000, to 37 to 46,000, you'll see that there's not a lot of benefit from going over that 35, 36. The oil contents, there are some differences there, but I know I'll get a slap on the wrist for this axis on this graph, or well, I should actually if I don't, in that you'll see that the axis there only stretches from pretty much 39.2 to 40.6. So while that actual difference there looks very impressive, it's really not. Spoils a good story. Yeah, thanks, Kath. So here's just some other data. Again, another site from Pine Ridge showing a similar relationship. So if we move on to row spacing, I've included two sets of data here. One set's from Moree, where you're looking at that lower yield potential in terms of topping out at about 1.2 tonnes to the hectare on a dryland situation. The other set I've got is a slightly higher yield potential off the plains, so up to 2.5. If your yield potential is only in that 1 to 1.5 tonne to the hectare on a dryland situation, you are better off going with a solid 1 metre and keeping away from those narrow row spacings. As this pretty much shows, at Moree, solids on 1 metre, single skips on a metre, quite viable, even single skips on a 75. But once you bring that the population in onto a narrower row spacing, then you start to see a drop off there in your yield.
You've established the same population all in row spacing.
Yeah. So this is comparing the same population across different row spacing. If we go down to Corindi, you'll start to see that there are some benefits from staying slightly closer in terms of your row spacing. So the most popular row spacing on the plains is a solid 75 centimetre. You could quite happily do a single skip on a 75 centimetre, but you wouldn't want to go out to a very wide 1.5 metre solid or a single skip 1 metre. You could still go with a solid 1 metre, and that's becoming a little bit more popular as well. But as your yield potential increases, generally your actual row spacing tends to come in as well. Okay. So we'll move on to crop nutrition. So we're halfway there. Hope you're still hanging in there. Okay. So sunflowers, in terms of a nutrient removal, are quite, I'd say, reasonable when you compare them to crops like grain sorghum. The most important and largest nutrient removed there by far is nitrogen, but you also see there's quite a lot of potassium removed in sunflowers as well. The interesting thing with potassium is that a large proportion of it is actually in the stover. So that's everything except the seed. So it's the backs of the heads and the stems. So that means that material is returned to your ground afterwards, whereas your nitrogen, we're still exporting quite significant amounts in the seed itself. Okay. So why is nitrogen important? I think I said it earlier, but it pretty much impacts on nearly everything. Nitrogen impacts on your yield, your oil content, the size of your leaves, the number of your leaves. Can't overemphasize how important it is to get the nitrogen right. In particular, there's a very strong relationship between nitrogen supply and water supply. And that's probably more critical always for dryland people. Most of the work has been done with just applying up front, so there hasn't been much work in Australia done on top dressing. Commercially, growers have done a bit with top dressing, and there has been some work done in France. Yeah, but that's probably most of it at this point. Yeah. So sunflower nitrogen uptake, as you can pretty much see in this graph, there's quite a lot of nitrogen going out in the seed there, that blue component of the graph. So let's try and explain the relationship between nitrogen and starting soil water a little bit more. This is some data that belongs to Steph. So this is from a site at Gurley, east of Moree. Really the relationship we're trying to show you here is that there's a crossover between yield and oil content. You can continue to increase your yield, but if you oversupply the nitrogen, you'll actually reduce your oil contents. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So how do we actually try and target that? Firstly, it's going to depend on your end use. So if you're supplying oilseed sunflowers, then this is very important. If you're supplying confectionaries, then you're really just looking to push out the yield as much as possible. So there's some good data there showing just how important nitrogen is to all of these factors like seed number and seeds per plant. As I said earlier, seed number is a major driver of yield. I think this is probably the most important slide that I'll show all morning. So if you get this slide, I'm usually saying to people, if you go away after this slide and say, I actually understood what you were saying here, I'd be pretty happy if you forgotten most of the rest of it and had to refer to the manual. So we started looking at soils from growers' paddocks and also from our trials across northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. So what we wanted to try and do was be able to say to people, if you knew what your starting soil water was and your starting soil nitrogen, that we could give you a good indication of what your oil contents are likely to be. So whether or not you'll be above the 40% standard. So what we've done is we soil cored a range of paddocks for those two factors, and then we turned it into a ratio. So in a very simple system here, you can see that as the ratio of nitrate to water at sowing gets over this way, so greater than 1, the oil contents tend to decline. So where's the critical point there? It's basically that once you move that ratio out from a 1 to 1, so in other words, 100 millimetres of plant available water to 100 kilos of nitrogen, once you start to take that ratio out where you've got more nitrogen than you've got water in a dryland situation, then you know starting up front that you can have a strong potential for lower oil contents if you don't end up with substantial in-crop rain. So with nitrogen, before we move off that, there is some basic budgeting tools, and I've included a budget in the manual so you can actually refer to that and then try and take into account your starting soil nitrogen, what your target yields are, so what you're trying to actually set for the end of the season, and how much fertiliser you should apply. But we can't spend all our time on nitrogen, so we need to look at a couple of other nutrients. So sulphur in particular has a very important partnership with nitrogen. Most people think of sulphur as being important for the oil contents, similar to canola, and they are, because particularly where sulphur is deficient at the budding stage, which is when we start to see all those key kind of factors being determined for sunflowers, you can then see major reductions in things like your oil yield if the sulphur is limiting at that point. If I try and provide hints for the questions at the end, you should remember this graph. So this graph basically shows the uptake of sulphur through the plant's growth stages. Now, sunflower uses or uptakes most of its sulphur in that key stage from budding to flowering. So if we look at potassium, again, not a huge amount of work that's been done there in the past. It's something we're working on at the moment. And generally speaking, most producers, unless they're in a situation where they're putting sunflowers in a rotation with cotton, for example, tend not to have a problem with potassium. But if you're in a rotation where you're exporting a lot of potassium, then it might be something you would want to consider in your soil tests. Phosphorus is probably the least addressed nutrient in sunflower research worldwide, even though we know it is one of the biggest deficiencies in terms of our soils. As a general rule, we try and relate phosphorus to getting some good starter on there to get that early seedling vigour. And then the other component being looking for rotations where you're expecting your VAM levels to still be quite high. So sunflowers following canola are not ideal, not only from a disease point of view, but because of the fact that canola doesn't host VAM. Sunflowers have very high dependency on VAM, on that beneficial fungi in the soil, so we try and put them in a place that's going to suit them. Again, there's some material in there, and these uptake graphs are all pretty much from Robert Hurd in Canada. But that's probably the best information that's out there at the moment. Okay, last section, so we're on the home straight. The last section's all about water use and irrigation. If I said there was an area of research that was probably the most limiting in sunflowers, it would have to be irrigation. So what I've done is most of the best data that I've ever seen has come out of either Kansas or North Dakota. So when I've been over there in the past, I've tended to borrow their information and try and drag it across over here. We are trying to build our own data set, so hopefully we'll have some better data in the future. But let's look at water use first up. So sunflowers are a taprooted plant. Their actual roots grow very quickly. So in comparison to something like sorghum, which the roots grow at about 2.5 centimetres a day, sunflower roots grow at 3.2 to 3.5 centimetres a day. They're actually extracting water a little bit beyond that front anyway. So they're usually extracting water down to about 3.8 centimetres each day. So they're growing very rapidly, in particular in those early stages. And your maximum rooting depth will be reached pretty much at 50% flowering, so that R5.5 stage. If you're dryland, it's good to be able to try and determine what your starting soil water is. So how much water are you holding in the profile, and how much of that is actually available to the sunflower crop? Now, on the AppSoil database on the internet, there's about 800 soils across New South Wales that have been characterised for their plant water holding capacities. Steph and I did some work across a range of sites across the Liverpool Plains and around Moree, actually establishing some of these crop lower limits. So that is the point where sunflowers couldn't draw any more water out of the profile. So if you're into actually doing some soil coring and drying those soils, you can use these kind of figures to determine how big your bucket really is. In terms of sunflower water use, this is some data that Trevor Philp from Pack Seeds lent to me. I liked it not because it was all these Queensland sites, but for the fact that it illustrated very well how sunflower water use is. Early on, their water use is quite low in these growth stages. It's not until you get to budding that you start to see this major increase in water use up here as you get into the stages of flowering. So how can we use that information to actually manage our irrigation timings? Their water demand's relatively low until about 10 days after that bud visible stage. Okay, so we're looking at until about that R2 stage. After that, their water use demand actually increases quite rapidly. So when do we apply our irrigations to try and match that? Now, if you're on a situation where you can have a full profile at planting, depending on your soil type obviously, but most soil types you'll tend to have sufficient water there if you've got a full profile to get you to budding. Now, if you're going through those vegetative growth stages and you see the crop starting to visually stress, i.e. it wilts during the day and doesn't recover at night, and you're irrigating, then that's probably a key indicator that you should be applying some water. The kind of, I suppose, factors that need to be considered there are always going to be the soil type and how hot it is in the season and what your water holding conditions are and whether there's any other restraints in that profile. So I think I've pretty much covered off on that. If they're wilting at night, you should be concerned, particularly if they're staying wilted at night for more than a few days. You can start to do some serious damage to your yield. There's a little bit of data out there about depletion fractions. There's not a huge amount that's available. So if you're looking at in-crop irrigations, when do we target them? Now, most of the time with sunflowers on raised beds and a flood type situation, we're looking at probably 1 to 2 in-crop irrigations plus a pre-watering. Obviously, if you're using lateral moves or overhead irrigation, then you've got more options and you're going to be applying more irrigations more frequently. When to actually irrigate though, if you have options and you're trying to minimise the number of irrigations you have to apply, target the key growth stages. So target bud initiation and then those stages through flowering. With irrigation during flowering, the biggest risk is if you're using overhead irrigation, that you don't want to be irrigating, particularly early in the mornings when pollen is being released and you have the potential to actually wash the pollen off the flowers and actually affect the actual potential for fertilisation of those seeds. So pollen is generally released quite early in the morning, well, early so to speak, 6 to 8 a.m. So you want to be making sure that there's no water going on at that time. Yeah, it's a compromise and you're probably better off watering evening rather than watering early morning when you know that that pollen's going to be released. Sue's going to talk a bit more about irrigation and how we actually manage irrigation with disease management as well, because we're obviously trying to keep our leaves as clean as possible. And when you're in an irrigated system, humidity tends to be higher in the crop, your populations are often higher, so there's a bigger biomass to support, and the canopies will be larger, so there'll be a bit more about that later. As I said, we're starting to try and build our own data set here. So this is just 1 year's data from this past season at Breezer. Some work that my colleagues and I have done, where we looked at just one irrigation. If you could only irrigate once in the crop, when would you do it? From this data, you can see that in quite a wet summer, you can still actually end up with a fairly large response to just one irrigation at early budding. And what happened with this site was it was quite wet leading up to that budding stage, but then once we'd applied that irrigation, it got quite dry, and so dry that I actually applied another timing of an irrigation just at early flowering. What's actually happened here is the crop has stressed in between these 2 points. So when I didn't apply the irrigation early enough, I've managed to take off about a tonne of yield. So that's about following those visual indicators as well as any other tools that you are using. There's a little bit of data like this from Kansas, which compares the different types of irrigation, so whether it's on hills or beds, etc. Important part is that really there's no significant difference there with those guys. So waterlogging. What are the risks with you actually irrigating or with the crop getting very wet feet? Obviously the worst case scenario is that you kill the crop. Okay? Now that's when things are pretty bad. Hopefully we won't be going there anytime soon. But generally, how could you kill a crop? Well, it's through having waterlogging at the more sensitive growth stages. So when the plants are small, or particularly when you're leading into budding, then those are kind of quite sensitive stages before the plants have developed very good root systems and the ability to withstand quite a lot of water. If you're irrigating, so you're getting those waterlogging events, anything longer than about 48 hours, you can start to see some major impacts on your yield. Why does this happen? Well, it's very straightforward. When the soil becomes waterlogged, there's a lack of oxygen, and that means those plants' physiological processes are impaired. It's not actually able to take up the water and the nutrients, and in effect, it's drowning. On the other side of the coin, when do we want to really avoid moisture stress? And the most critical periods here are basically from just prior to flowering, so that budding stage, right through to seed film. If you're irrigating, you want to make sure that you're stopping your irrigation by about mid-seed fill though, so you're actually getting the opportunity to dry down your profile so your paddocks are suitable to actually traffic for harvest. Moisture stress here, this is some work by Antonio Hall over in Argentina, has shown that during head initiation, seed number and yield are going to be fairly major impacts if you end up with a stress at that point in time. If your stress occurs before a head initiation, then the plant has the ability to compensate in some ways by changing its leaf number.